Hello again, dear viewer, and welcome to the best Factorio mod that no one is talking about, Exotic Industries. But what is Exotic Industries, you might be asking? Well, it's an overhaul mod, one that adds tons of new buildings, recipes and materials, completely changes how science progression works, reworks several key game mechanics like resource mining, nuclear power, oil refining and more, adds many brand new game mechanics, and even dabbles a bit in multi-planet logistics a la space exploration. And honestly, that's just scratching the surface. The central premise of Exotic Industries is the new science progression system. Similarly to something like the Age of Empires series, your technological progress is locked behind milestones called ages. The Dark Age, Steam Age, Electric Age, and so on. We start off in the Dark Age, which pretty much just translates to the Burner Age. Coal-powered miners, assemblers, inserters, you get the gist. Another change this mod makes is that stone patches no longer exist. Instead, you can pull stone straight out of the ground with special buildings, or just handcrafted from thin air. But this makes getting the early stone you need for furnaces and burner miners really annoying, so I suggest finding a map seed with lots of rocks at the start. But other than that, the early game is pretty much the same as you'd expect in vanilla Factorio. Hand-fed assemblers and endless trips back and forth to resupply coal. At least the science pack is very cheap and quick to craft. You really don't want to spend much time in the Dark Age, and thankfully it's designed so that you won't have to. No research in this mod has a set cost. Instead they all start at the same cost of 10 science packs, but with every completed research the cost of all others increases. So that means you can choose to rush certain technologies and are actually incentivized to skip over the ones you won't need. And there we go. After just a few completed researches we unlock our first milestone, the Steam Age. This is where we'll actually have buildings good enough to make a real base. But weirdly enough, being in the Steam Age doesn't mean we just get the ability to make steam-powered bases. That's still a few researches away. It doesn't stop me from setting up a few things for the base beforehand though. If you've ever played something like Industrial Revolution, you're already familiar with how steam power in these mods works. But if you haven't, it basically means everything is gonna need to be connected by pipes carrying steam. And of course, the first thing to do is use the steam to automate coal input to the boilers for an infinite power loop. And now that we have access to steam inserters and steam assemblers, it's time to get to work on the first furnace stacks. Also, the steam inserter is just a regular inserter with a pipe going through it, which I think looks ridiculous and I love it. Now is also probably a good time to explain a bit about how smelting works in this mod. Mining these ore patches gives you poor ore chunks. As to why they're poor, I'll explain later, but smelting them gives you ingots and also a byproduct of slag, which you deal with by basically just turning it into stone, so it's not that big of a deal. Ingots though aren't used in almost anything by themselves and need to go into assemblers to be turned into one of three things: plates, beams and mechanical parts, which are the ingredients used in pretty much everything else. And the best thing to do when you're playing a mod where you won't know entirely what you will need in what quantities is to just shove everything onto a main bus and worry about it later. Now that I have actually usable resources on belts, it's time to free myself from handcrafting hell with an early mall. And since everything needs to be surrounded by pipes and I'm 1 hour into a run with a 6-lane bus, that means I'll probably need thousands of belts and pipes. And since I also want automated inserters and assemblers, I'll need these steam engines. Probably a good time to mention that in this mod, you can choose which side of the belt your inserters drop on. So that's why I'm able to just build in straight lines like this and get out fully saturated belts. Honestly, this is such a great feature and I have no idea why it's not in the base game. And now that we have all the building supplies automated, it's time to make some real science production. The red and green sciences are very cheap and quick to craft, and with the scaling science costs I'm very grateful for that. Sadly there aren't any steam powered labs, so we're stuck with the burners that I will inevitably forget to resupply with coal. And of course, with so much building we attract the attention of the local biters. You might have noticed these aren't just your regular everyday biters. The recommended mods for the official Exotic Industries mod pack include these new toxic biters that leave behind clouds of poison when killed, and also armor biters, which are just slower but tankier versions of regular biters. And since even the mod's in-game wiki says that the enemies aren't a major focus, I've opted to play on a real world preset, mainly to avoid having to deal with biter expansion so I can focus on the interesting parts of the mod. And because this is modded Factorio, we have a new and weird way of making steel. First you need to cook some coal in this special furnace to turn it into coke. Then you crush the coke in this other building called the crusher. Combine that with some crushed iron to make steel blend, and finally smelt the steel blend in a furnace to get steel ingots. And don't forget, you still need to turn those ingots into actually usable beams and mechanical parts. And there we go, the quick and simple 6-step process of making steel. The biters keep being a nuisance and not letting me build, so let's make a car and go scout around our pollution cloud. And I'm not sure if this is a bug or something, but just look at how fast touching this poison cloud kills me. Oh well, at least the turrets cleaned up the nest after I died. Also, while driving around I ran into this weird looking alien building. We'll talk about these later, but for now I have no idea what to do with this thing, so I just pick it up and drive off. Now that there aren't any annoying biters in our pollution cloud, let's get back to building. The next resource we need is glass. Glass is made by smelting sand in a furnace. And as you might have guessed, sand is made from crushing stone. For now I can just use the stone from the slag byproduct made by our furnaces, but that won't be enough for long. So here's those infinite stone buildings I mentioned at the start of the run. These are still burners though, so technically this is just a coal to stone converter, but we'll get better ones later. Also, since I'm making stone, I might as well turn some of it into bricks for later. And we've finally done enough research to unlock the electric age. The electric age is probably the closest this mod gets to vanilla Factorio. This is where you get things like power poles, electric mining drills, regular yellow, red and blue inserters, and so on. But that's still far away for us. For now we need to make the actual science pack. We already have 2 of the components, in steel and engine units, that just leaves green circuits. And oh boy are the green circuits in this mod something. To make them, first we'll need another set of stone quarries to make more sand. Then we'll combine that sand with some steam to make ceramics. Combine the ceramics with glass and copper wire to make electron tubes. And finally make the circuit from the electron tubes plus copper wire and iron plates. This entire factory block here is what's needed for just a handful of green circuits per second. Well, thankfully the overall demand for green circuits isn't that high in this mod, so this will be enough for a while. Now to plug in the ingredients and make our first electric age science packs. And then I realize the burner labs can only accept the first 2 science packs, and I need electric labs to actually use the new science. Oh well, I can just leech some steam off the base to feed a few steam engines to make the electricity we need to run the labs. But just because we have access to electricity doesn't mean we'll be scrapping this base just yet. So far the ages have been relatively quick to progress through, and the resource costs are small enough to where we can manage with just the starter patches. But that's not gonna be the case going forward. We'll need to scale up massively before tackling the next age. So the goal for this Steam starter base now becomes getting us through the early electric age research and making enough supplies to build a much bigger and better electric base. And that starts with these electric engines. They're needed in pretty much every building from now on. With so much production going, it's time for some extra iron plates to keep up with the demand. And no matter how much I put it off, there's no running from it forever. It's time for oil. While in vanilla Factorio, early game oil processing is as simple as crude oil in, petroleum out, Exotic Industries won't let us get away that easy. And this whole process is a bit of a doozy, and I'll try my best to explain it, so pay attention. To even start the oil refining process, you need to put crude oil and water into these heat-based oil refineries. Heat is generated in these fluid boilers, which take in any fluid with a fuel value as input, which includes crude oil, so we can just feed them off that. You connect heat to the refineries using these low temperature heat pipes, which lose heat the further they travel from the source, so be careful with that. Once you have heat and oil in your refineries, you get the normal petroleum gas plus something called residual oil. Residual oil by itself is useless and will eventually clog up the system, so you need to distill it in these distillation towers, which gives you light oil and medium oil distillate. The medium oil distillate needs to be run through another distillation tower to give you heavy oil distillate and something called kerosene, which I won't go into right now, but the heavy oil distillate needs to be run through yet another distillation tower to give you heavy oil and the new fluid called lubricant distillate, which can once again be distilled to get you lubricant, and for some reason coke is a byproduct. Yeah, quite a bit more work than your regular old oil processing. And that's all before even placing down a single chemical plant to actually make anything useful out of any of these fluids. But for now we won't need much of any of these things, so I'm just gonna burn off the excess heat using these overflow valves. And the main reason I wanted oil was because red belts need plastic in this mod. Also, we need sulfuric acid for this thing here called an energy crystal. It's a whole other rabbit hole I won't be going into now, but all you need to know is I'm gonna need some for power armor and robots later. Since we already have all the ingredients, we might as well make some red circuits as well. I'll need very few of these, so even just this many assemblers will do the job. And now with all the resources taken care of, it's time to make a real mall. There we go. Now every building we'll need to build the real base will be slowly building up. And yes, this mall is an absolute spaghetti mess, but I'm not entirely sure it's even possible for it not to be with so many intermediates and pipes running everywhere. And here's the only early game use for kerosene, making diesel which you need to fuel trains. Now before I go off building a massive new base, I want some personal construction robots. The problem with that is I don't think making robots with a base this bad is entirely intended. I would go into why getting robots was such a pain, but I'm only on hour 5 of the playthrough, and if I keep talking this much the video is gonna end up 3 hours long, so just take my word that it was a whole adventure to get this equipment. And of course, building a big base means clearing out a lot of biters. Now that's a lot of real estate. And since we're gonna be building a big base and don't have access to nuclear yet, the first thing I'm doing is converting this entire coal patch here into a giant power plant. And with power secured, it's time to start work on the first train network. Surprisingly, even with how many items are in this mod, the resource requirements don't seem that crazy. So even just 1 mine per resource should be enough. Also, I'm still using the regular ore patches, since there's no way I can produce enough drill fluid to use the better ones for now. Okay, so now we have a functional rail network and all the resources we need. And can you hear the music picking up? You know what that means. Now, it might have seemed like a lot of building, but the only thing we built so far is just the skeleton of a real base. We pretty much have everything we did in the last base, but now at scale and not reliant on steam. But sadly we won't get very far with just more of the old stuff, so it's time to diversify. Gold is the first of the new resources that can only be found in the deep ore veins. And smelting it is pretty much the same as normal, but since it comes from the deep veins, we can first run it through these purifiers to get pure gold, which is more efficient. And unlike the other ores, gold can only be turned into plates, so that saves a bit on machinery. And now that we have gold, the first and most important thing we'll make with it are these semiconductor wafers. They're needed in a bunch of future items, and they also give us access to significantly more efficient circuit recipes. We have all the ingredients on hand except this fluid called hydrofluoric acid. It's made by combining water and sulfuric acid with fluoride, which is just made by the dirty water we're producing from the gold purifiers. The next important thing is those energy crystals from earlier. The initial recipe to craft them is horrible and completely unfeasible to use in mass production. Thankfully, once you have one crystal, you can put it into these crystal growers along with some sulfuric water to start duplicating them. This process starts off slow, but it gets exponentially faster the longer it works. Thankfully, in the process of making the semiconductors, we get out some of the sulfuric water, but just in case it's not enough, I'll set up some actual production as well. And here's that better green circuit recipe. It uses a bit of sulfuric acid, but sulfur is basically free, so it's not a problem. We also need these insulated wires. They're used in a lot of things, so on the bus they go. And also red circuits. It appears the base is expanded over to this thing called a teleporter. Huh, I wonder what it does. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And while I was messing around with teleporters, we've advanced to the computer age. There's gonna be a lot of things to do in the computer age, but I think they're best explained when we get to them. But we'll get none of that new cool age stuff unless we make the science pack first. And that starts with these CPUs. They eat up quite a bit of red circuits and semiconductors, and they're only used in one thing. But that thing is pretty important. It's these electronic parts. They're used in pretty much everything from now on. And now to rebuild the sciences. You've already seen the first 3 sciences, so there isn't much to say there. And here's the new computer age science pack. Slightly more complicated, but nothing too scary. And there's another resource we haven't used yet. Lead. It, like gold, only appears in deep veins and it isn't used nearly as much as gold. We'll need some for nuclear power though, so it's best to get it running early. And now to make some actual robot production. The robot frames in this mod are even more complicated than usual, taking in 6 ingredients, one of which is a fluid. But since we already have everything on belts, it's not too big of a problem. Also, I need concrete for roboports, but why would I rebuild it when there's a warehouse with 100,000 concrete sitting around in the old base? And what kind of computer age would it be without computers? These things are called computer cores. They take in electronic parts and like 15 megawatts of power each to make a resource called computing power. It acts basically the same as a fluid, but it can only be transported by these special cables. For now, the only thing we can do with it is make this simulation data, but is the key to a lot of new technologies. Most importantly, requester chests. This mod has an absolutely insane amount of different buildings, so the sooner we can get a bot mall up and running, the better. And this entire thing is probably about half the total buildings in this mod. Time to unleash the bots. It's gonna take a while for it to actually start filling up, but this is modded Factorio. The concept of time might as well not exist. Oh yeah, there's also a tiny Spidertron in this mod called a Spiderling. It's mostly just useful for the extra inventory space though. And with how much power the base is drawing now, steam engines aren't gonna cut it much longer. Time to get some uranium. Once again, it's in these deep veins. Thankfully, the drills use so little fluid that one train can supply all of them. And while that builds up, it's time to start working on the next science pack. From here on, it's no longer one science pack per age. The computer age, for example, branches off into the simulation science pack and the knowledge science pack. The simulation pack is pretty straightforward. We'll just need this ammonia gas, which is made by pulling oxygen and nitrogen out of the air with these air filters and combining them. And once again, the labs can't accept the new science pack. But this time we're upgrading to these gigantic advanced labs. They draw 20 megawatts of power, but thankfully they have 6 module slots, so some efficiency modules will do wonders. But I don't want to be crutching on efficiency modules forever, so let's get uranium processing running. Nuclear in this mod is very different than in vanilla. First, you need to run the uranium ore through a crusher to get crushed uranium and stone as a byproduct. And then you run the crushed uranium through a purifier along with sulfuric acid to make purified uranium and rich uranium solution. The purified uranium goes into a chemical plant to make uranium hexafluoride, plus sand and nuclear waste as byproducts. The uranium hexafluoride goes into centrifuges to finally give us the normal uranium products we're used to, but also spits out almost all the hexafluoride that went in. So the solution to not letting it back up is routing the output back in as input and only letting the initial hexafluoride flow in when the level in the pipes gets too low. But just because we have usable uranium doesn't mean we're done with this whole process. To make nuclear reactors we need this thing called fission data, which is made in this fission research facility. And lastly, you need these nuclear waste storage silos to keep the whole process from backing up with nuclear waste. Well, that was a lot of steps, but at least now we're done and we won't have to worry about uranium-related problems for a while. Now the next thing we want is blue circuits. There's two ways of making them, but one of them just straight up sucks, so I won't even go into it. First we need this silicon, and it's the first of many recipes going forward that spits out a ton of its input as output, so we need a way to keep it from backing up. The silicon is only used to make these advanced semiconductors, which are needed for blue circuits. I'm also gonna need this nitric acid. There's a bunch of chemistry in this mod, but almost all of it is combining gases that you can just pull for free from the atmosphere, so it's not very interesting. And just like that, we have blue circuits. I added a timer for the sake of the video, but honestly, I'm starting to regret it. Just seeing it up there makes me feel pressured to always be doing something. Can't even relax and take the time to appreciate the factory. But, well, it's keeping me productive at least. It's not all bad. You've seen energy crystals. Now get ready for high energy crystals. Like the previous version, the initial recipe is horrible, but once you have one, you can start duplicating them. And since this process is extremely slow, it's best to start having these build up as soon as possible. And surprisingly, we see a recipe that's completely unchanged from the base game. Low density structures. But just because it's unchanged doesn't mean it's not still extremely expensive. But thankfully until much later the only thing we'll need them for are a few buildings. And here's another brand new mechanic. Hypercoolers. They take in nitrogen or oxygen and turn them into their hypercooled liquid forms. Also, any extreme temperature fluids can only be transported in these insulated pipes, else they just turn back into their regular versions. And it's finally time to put that uranium to use. You might think this reactor design makes no sense, but in exotic industries, nuclear reactors gain no neighbor bonus and always generate exactly 200 megawatts of power. It makes early reactors easier and cheaper to set up, but limits their usability in the late game. And since Kovarax enrichment doesn't exist in this mod, we're using steam buffers to not waste any uranium. And just in case you were in danger of thinking this mod doesn't have enough crazy new things, here's the drone port. It lets you take control of this tiny flying drone which can be used to build or just fly around and scout. And this drone is the key to a whole part of the game I haven't even touched on yet. Now say hello to the Dimensional Gate. It's a portal to a whole new world called Gaia. The engineer can't survive on Gaia, so the only way to interact with it is using the drone. Sadly, we aren't ready to tackle Gaia just yet. I usually skip over most of it in these videos, but there's plenty of chores to take care of. Like expanding the rail network and getting more gold so production doesn't completely stop every couple of minutes due to the lack of semiconductors. Also, of course, clearing biters that get too close to the pollution cloud. And it's starting to get quite difficult to do that with just a tank. So instead, let's make a second suit of power armor and fill it with these new tier 2 personal lasers and exoskeletons. Yeah, that makes it much easier. Alright, now let's get back to business. The only way to send items to and from Gaia is using the gate. You need to set the target location to be a container where the items will show up. And there's no way to send power from your main base to Gaia, so using these alien crystal accumulators, plus regular accumulators and solar panels is a good start. The best way to automate transport of items to Gaia is by using a requester warehouse on set requests mode and a constant combinator with the values of items we want. But now that we have the basic infrastructure in place, Gaia has a bunch of its own unique challenges. Firstly, we're stuck on a small piece of land in a large ocean, making space limited and resources sparse. And there's two new resources we'll need here, cryoflux and pytogas. They're both gases and they're mostly just used on Gaia, so it's just a matter of running some pipes. And the complication comes in that both of them can only be accessed by deep mining, so we'll need to import drill fluid. And each requires another fluid to function, similar to uranium in vanilla. Cryoflux requires steam, and what's a better way of making steam than to just build a whole nuclear reactor here for the sole purpose of mining cryoflux. Pytogas needs sulfuric water, but conveniently there's some sulfur deposits right next to us, so we can just produce it here instead of having to import it. Alright, now that we have both gases, let's get to the real reason we're here, making the ingredients for the next science pack. And here's where we get introduced to the main concept behind all Gaia processes, loops. Take for example this very first basic process. You need to feed in an alien seed along with some phytogas and the planet's special water to get 6 alien resin and also a 90% chance of getting back the seed you just put in. With some luck, this process will keep itself going for a while if you just feed back the same seeds over and over, but it will eventually run out and stop. And that's where the second process comes in. You put in 4 alien resin and 1 seed to get a blooming seed, which by itself is useless, but with this third process you can turn 4 blooming seeds into 12 regular seeds. And using some quick maths, we realized that this whole chain actually makes a surplus of every single one of its inputs. This thing I've built here isn't actually very well thought out, but I just wanted to get the science rolling quickly, so for now it's gonna do the job. And now that Gaia is at least barely chugging along, let's get done with the final computer age science pack. Okay, this mess on Gaia is working even worse than I expected. You can get away with having only a small amount of production on Gaia, but it at least needs to be consistent. So after spending some time in a creative world playing around with designs, I come up with something like this. I'm not sure it's entirely deadlock proof, but it's at least gonna be way more robust than what we have right now. And another thing we'll need from Gaia is this stuff called cryodust. It's just cryoflux combined with sand, so pretty simple in comparison. And with so much production now, I'm also gonna need a way to make sure my warehouses don't deadlock. If you've ever played space exploration, you probably recognize these buildings. They're used to transfer circuit signals across different surfaces. So I'm just gonna be stopping the input belts from working if I have over a certain amount of the resource back at the base. Now that we have all the Gaia resources coming in, we've unlocked a whole bunch of new and annoying processes to deal with. Like this cryodust enriching. It takes in cryodust, sulfur, and cryoflux, and spits out cryocondensate and some of the cryodust that went in. Then you take the cryocondensate and you put it into these distillation towers along with nitrogen and crushed coal to get enriched cryodust and once again more cryocondensate that we need to route back into the input. And now that we have the enriched cryodust, we can also make these advanced engines. They'll give us access to higher tiers of almost every building. Better assemblers, refineries, chemical plants, centrifuges, mining drills, etc. And best of all, we get better exoskeletons. Now that's a running speed I can live with. Now I need to start thinking ahead for the last science packs. And that means modules. Most of the advanced buildings have a ton of module slots, so that makes them even more valuable than normal. And since this mod has modules going all the way up to tier 6, the normal tier 3 ones aren't terribly expensive, so I can start building up a stockpile of them from now. They're more complicated to make than vanilla modules, since you need this module core, which in turn needs these module parts, but luckily we have a gigantic bus right next to us carrying all the needed items. And we can also use them to squeeze some extra production out of the struggling parts of the current base. And shockingly, we aren't done with Gaia yet. We need this stuff called biomatter. And do I even need to tell you that the process of making it is again one big loop? We do need to import some crushed coal to make it run though. And the reason we needed the biomatter is for this suspicious plating. It's fairly cheap and used in a whole bunch of other things later. And since it's a Gaia process, of course it spits out some of its input. And since I now have access to better refineries and distillation towers, it's time for an upgraded oil setup. These advanced refineries are 3 times as fast as the old heat-based ones, and they accept modules. So this design is gonna be spitting out way more oil than I know what to do with. And the first thing to do with all this oil is to make rocket fuel. It takes solid fuel, kerosene, and a ton of liquid oxygen. And we're gonna need a lot of it later. Also, let's make a new plastic build with all this new petroleum. With these new chemical plants, only 6 of them are needed to make almost a whole blue belt of plastic. Now it's time to start finally working towards a rocket. And that starts with RCUs. They're needed to make these rocket parts, and they're by far the most expensive intermediate so far. So we'll be filling them up with the best productivity modules we have access to. And once we have that, we're ready to start launching rockets. All we need are the rocket parts and some rocket fuel. Also, the rocket has 8 module slots that I'm filling with tier 3 prod mods. It's gonna be slow, but it'll massively decrease the amount of rocket parts we need. Let's just take a moment and appreciate the base. It's taken us this far, but I'm afraid it's reaching its limit. But that's a worry for slightly later. And there we have it, our first rocket. Sadly it doesn't win us the game, but it does give us this space data, which is needed for the next age of science, the quantum age. And since I forgot to talk about it when I first unlocked it, we're jumping straight into building the science pack. It's very expensive for our current level of production, but it's the last science pack we'll be making in this base. And even getting it into the labs was a nightmare with my current setup. Now it's finally time to make a Spidertron. And we'll be filling it with roboports to make building faster and easier. That's because the next thing on the agenda is making an entire new base. Yes, nearly 28 hours into the run we'll be leaving our old base behind. As we've been progressing through the tech tree, we've gotten access to faster and more efficient ways of making pretty much everything. Starting with ingots. Using these ore trunks from deep mining allows us to use this better process. After running the ore through these purifiers, we can use these arc furnaces to melt it down into its liquid molten form. And then we feed the molten metal into these casters to finally get our ingots. This build here will give us just over 6 blue belts of iron ingots, and we'll be using trains to both bring in the ore and take away the ingots. And also an extra train to take away all the dirty water that the ore purification creates. And thankfully the process is exactly the same for all the other metals, so copy and paste is back on the menu. But what good is smelting with no ore to smelt? Using these tier 2 deep drills and speed modules we can get an absolutely ridiculous amount of ore from each vein. And here's a new ore we haven't seen so far. Neodymium. I have no idea how to pronounce this. It's the most complicated of the metals to process, but it's not used much, so it's not too much of a headache. And after building a few of these from just my inventory, I realized that these builds are just way too big and decided to connect the main base's robot network and just have the robots slowly build them for me. Having robots fly this far is very much not ideal, but I'm nearly 30 hours into this run and extremely tired of running back to the base to pick up more supplies. Also, some of the new buildings require refined concrete, so I'm setting some up now. And while the robots finish up the smelting setups, I'm gonna get some quick and dirty neodymium processing up. I'll need a bit for some buildings that I'd rather have stockpiling up from now. Unlike the other ores, neodymium can only be processed through the arc furnaces and casters. First though, it needs to go into a crusher to get out crushed neodymium. Then it needs to go into the purifier to get purified crushed neodymium, and only then can it be smelted down in the arc furnace. And that just to make the ingot. To turn the ingot into a usable plate, it needs to be combined with cryodust and liquid nitrogen. It's also the only way to produce cryoflux outside of Gaia. The main reason we wanted the plate is to make these neodymium magnets. They're mostly used towards the endgame, but for now we'll need them to make some of the buildings we'll be using in the new base. And now it's time for the biggest blueprint yet, steel. In addition to the normal process of making molten iron, it also needs coal and an absolute ton of oxygen. And just look at how many belts this one design has. Thank God I've had blue belts stockpiling for hours. And here's the first train of iron chunks. This is a glimpse into the future, and the future is glorious. Also, let's make sure we have all the oil products on trains. Alright, as fun as it is to listen to the sound of my own voice, I really need to get this video done. So... It feels straight up wrong to just go over 8 hours of effort in a minute, but hey, at least we got a cool montage out of it. I wanted to make the new base a fully train-based one, but I figured I've already had 2 massive bus bases in this run, why fix what isn't broken? I have all the metals and most intermediates coming in on trains, but don't think that just because we have like a 50-lane bus means we're even close to being done yet. All of this has been preparing to tackle the last 2 ages of science and all the ridiculous products that come with them. The first thing we'll do is rebuild all the sciences at scale. Now that we have better assemblers and tier 3 modules, we can get out much more science from the same amount of resources. Most of the ingredients are already on belts right next to us, but we do still need to rebuild some things, like the combinators and ammonia for the computer sciences. And of course we'll need many rocket parts, because we won't just be launching one rocket from this base, we'll be launching many rockets. And here's the first two of those rockets. One of them will just be the standard one that brings back space data, and the second one we'll talk about slightly later. For now though, we need to prepare something else. Power. So far I've been surviving by just copy-pasting nuclear reactors, but that won't do in the late game. The solution to our power problems starts with these gases. This process gives us protium, with a very low chance of getting deuterium and tritium. We'll need all three later, but for now we'll just let them slowly build up. And unfortunately we need to go back to Gaia. Right now I'm just dropping all the Gaia products on trains from the old base and shipping them to the new one, hoping I wouldn't need to go back there. But there's one more thing we'll need, this biosludge. It's made from the biomatter process, but in such small quantities that it barely keeps itself going. I'm gonna add just a bit of small production focusing on biosludge, since I'll need some later. And here's the first of many ridiculous endgame recipes. These carbon fiber compounds. It doesn't seem that bad on the surface until you notice it has a 2-minute crafting time. They're needed mostly to launch rockets to further out destinations, but in such small amounts that we can just compensate for the crafting time with some speed modules. I've neglected to mention these so far, but this thing is called an alien beacon. It has a massive range and 8 module slots. There are regular beacons in this mod, but they need to be fed liquid nitrogen constantly to work, so that makes them very annoying to work around. So instead of bothering with that, I just opted to never use them. Can't have a problem if you just run away from it. Now the next science packs can't be made in assembling machines. Instead they're made in these nanomaterial factories. They can't accept productivity modules, so these last few sciences are gonna be very expensive. We're starting with the space quantum science pack. It needs space data, high energy rocket fuel, and something called moonfish. Well, the name is pretty self-explanatory. You get moonfish by launching fish to the moon. And high energy rocket fuel is just made by combining rocket fuel with this oxygen difluoride. Not very complicated to make. And there's our first quantum space age science packs. To make the other quantum pack, we'll need to start using these quantum computers. They take in computing power, liquid nitrogen, and a ton of power to make various different kinds of data. The main one we need is this superior data, which takes in simulation, space, and fission data. Also with the superior data we get access to this new bio armor with an absolutely ridiculous 14x14 equipment grid. All my old equipment can't even fill up half of this thing. And to make fusion quantum science, unsurprisingly we need fusion data. It's made by combining all the other kinds of data and it's pretty much only used in this science pack. Another thing we'll need are these neutron containers, both for the science and for power generation. And if we actually want to have space science automated, we'll need a steady supply of fish. Thankfully there's a recipe to grow fish in pretty much the exact same way we duplicate energy crystals. Behold the fish loop. Now back to those neutron containers. To actually make use of them we need to charge them first. The charging is basically done with any of the nuclear products, but since we've had those stockpiling up for 20 hours it won't be a problem. And there we go, we've now officially automated the entire quantum age. Now we're just one science pack away from winning the game. Here's what I needed that biosludge for, this enriched cryodust. This build is gonna be very slow, but it's best to start buffering up some from now. Before I start thinking about the next science, I'm first gonna take care of these advanced intermediates. Like these EM magnets, they craft so slow that I'll just feed them with a requester chest instead of bothering with belts. Now to rebuild the labs and finally put all this science to use. We also need these plasma cubes. Very simple compared to most other endgame products, we just need to run some protium through these plasma heaters. Another thing we'll need are these EU circuits. With how little enriched cryodust we're making, these are gonna be a pain to make, but if your only goal is winning the game, even a trickle will do. Now you've probably been looking at these 4 rockets here and wondering what they're for, since I've only been using 2 of them so far. Well, this mod has a lot of different places you can launch rockets to, as represented by those holograms to the side. You can get either different kinds of data or space rocks to turn into ores depending on what kind of satellite you send to each of them. Sadly though, if you aren't planning to go past the end of the game, most of them are pretty useless. And the main one we're interested in is the asteroid. We'll need to send both exploration and mining satellites there. The mining satellites will give us back 10,000 exotic rocks, which we'll need in the exotic age. And the exploration satellite will discover the last space destination we'll need to actually win. The exotic rocks you put into centrifuges to get exotic ore, and the exotic ore can then be turned into 2 different types of exotic matter. And after a few exploration satellites we discovered the black hole, and with it information on the black hole generator, which is our win condition. But sadly we still have some work to do before we can think about that. First we'll need to make high-tech parts. They're the only thing that actually uses exotic matter and therefore need to be crafted in these exotic assemblers. And since exotic matter is highly unstable, the assemblers will just explode unless they're placed next to these matter stabilizers. There's a whole process of balancing out the different kinds of exotic matter, but once again, unless you're planning to mega base, it's just much easier to produce more of both and just stick them in warehouses. And it's finally time to take care of our power issues. And since nuclear isn't a viable option in this mod, we'll be using fusion power. And the whole process of how fusion works would take too long to explain in detail at this point in the video. But basically, it takes liquid coolant plus a customizable combination of heated gases and generates a ton of power. In this case, we'll only be using tritium and the reactor will produce 7.2 gigawatts. And we still aren't done with power. Next thing on the to-do list is this induction matrix. It's yet another of the million new and complicated game mechanics in this mod. The induction matrix has several parts that all do different things, but basically the whole thing is just a gigantic accumulator. The amount of energy it can store and how fast it can output it depend on how you've set up the grid. I've set up mine like this and I'm sure this design isn't optimal by any means, but I'm pretty sure I was recording this at 3 AM and my brain just wasn't working anymore. And since there's pretty much nothing to do now except wait for research to finish so we can unlock the exotic age, I think this is a good time for a good old-fashioned yapping session. There's just so much I can say about this mod that if I did say all of it, it would probably be another 20-minute video by itself, so I'm gonna try to keep it brief. The reason I say this is the most underrated Factorio mod is because mostly whenever you hear people talking about modded Factorio, it's one of either Crastorio, Space Exploration, C-Block, maybe Pyanodons, and maybe I've missed it, but Exotic Industries just doesn't seem to come up in the conversation very much, and I think that's a gross injustice to this mod. While it does have some things I think could be different, this is one of the most creative and polished mods I've ever played, definitely up there with the big ones. In terms of complexity, I think it's a good middle difficulty mod, quite a bit more complex than something like Crastorio, but not overly difficult and time consuming like Space Exploration or C-Block. This video is almost an hour long, and even still there's a ton of stuff I didn't get the chance to talk about because there are just so many new things in this mod, and even some I didn't even touch in my entire playthrough. I might make a full standalone review, but for now all I'm gonna do is strongly recommend you give Exotic Industries a try for your next game of totally not addictive modded Factorio. And there we have it. The Exotic Age Science Pack is ready for production. Even with 5 tier 3 speed modules in every machine, it's still way slower than all our other sciences. But it's the end of the game, so I can live with that. Okay, I kinda lied when I said that was the last science pack. There's also the Black Hole Exotic Science Pack, but the only thing you can research with it is the win condition, so we'll only need a few hundred of it. And because I know what's coming, here's another induction matrix. I'm scared to even think about doing the math on how many accumulators this is equivalent to. The only new thing we'll need for the science pack is black hole data, which is just obtained by throwing satellites at the black hole. Don't ask me how the data comes back after the satellite reaches a black hole. And let's slap down another fusion reactor just for good measure. While we wait for the research to finish, let's get some preparations done. Just building the black hole generator doesn't win us the game. It'll need to be powered up through 2 stages. The first stage has us feeding the black hole with tons of matter. Basically we need to feed any item into the black hole to be destroyed. About 8 blue belts worth should be enough. And since stone is free and infinite in this mod, why not just feed a literal black hole with tons of rocks? And here's our generator. With this much stone flowing in, the first stage is over and done with pretty quickly. The second stage though, that's the problem. We'll need to use these as energy injector pylons to feed a continuous stream of 40 gigawatts into the black hole for a full minute. That's why we needed the fusion reactors and induction matrices, and God knows if it'll be enough. Alright, time to start the expansion. And there we have it. Our black hole has become stable and we finally beaten Exotic Industries. The playtime counter might say 50 hours, but I probably spent another 10 hours in a creative world figuring out how stuff works, so it's a bit fake. Well, dear viewer, thank you for coming on this first journey into modded Factorio with me. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I also hope you'll be around for my next one. Hey, I wonder what happens if I throw a nuke into the black hole.